It has long since been noted that Tolkien's works are very male-dominated. There is a minuscule number of female characters in these stories, and there's an even more minuscule number of mothers. The maternal mortality rates in Middle-earth are sky-high. Out of the 9 members of the Fellowship, 3 of their mothers are dead, one of them doesn't even technically have a mother, and the rest of their mothers are never mentioned or brought up in the story. And this absence seems even more obvious because there are a lot of fatherly relationships in Middle-earth, be that from birth fathers or foster father figures. But mothers, who I think we would all agree, tend to have a pretty serious impact on us, are conspicuously missing. There are some characters who are mothers when you dig a bit deeper into the lore, but they all have a very similar and frankly very limited impact on these stories that they're a part of. So why is it that Tolkien, who explored so many different forms and shapes of relationship with such depth and passion, why did he skirt around motherhood? Who are the mothers that we meet in Middle-earth? What patterns do these characters tend to follow? And why is it so important that we recognize and possibly change these patterns? If we're to start with Tolkien's most popular works, things are not looking great in terms of maternal representation. The Hobbit explores plenty of different kinds of familial relationships, uncles, brothers, nephews, even fathers, but there are no mothers, much less any female characters at all. The Lord of the Rings does slightly better. There are about half a dozen important female characters in this story, and some of them are even technically mothers, and this includes Galadriel. Depending on what lore you're looking at, Galadriel either had 1 or 2 children with her husband, and her daughter Celebrian would marry Elrond and give birth to Arwen before she was essentially killed. So Galadriel is, by all accounts, a mother, but I wouldn't say that it is her role in the story to be a very motherly character. The only reason that we find out about Celebrian's existence at all is not because she's present in the story, because she's long dead, but because Galadriel steps into a sort of grandmotherly role, giving Aragorn a gift that should have been from her own daughter, who would have been Aragorn's mother-in-law through Arwen. Galadriel gave birth to Celebrian some 6,000 years ago, and while no one ever stops being a mother, no matter how old they or their child are, the role that she's playing in the story is not of the maiden or the mother, if we're to look at this in terms of the feminine triad. And while Galadriel isn't a crone character, she's kind of gone even a step beyond that. She has become this spiritual guide. She is an angel more than a mother. At the very least, she is not a manifestation of what people consider to be motherly traits. What somebody considers to be motherly qualities is going to change a lot from person to person, and it is very difficult to figure out exactly what Tolkien thought to be motherly qualities because of just how few mothers there are in his stories. But I do think we can kind of reverse engineer these ideas by looking at what Tolkien deemed to be bad motherhood in the form of the giant spider Shelob. Shelob is fascinating to me because in the relatively sterile world of Middle-earth, she is one of the only characters that is depicted in terms of her reproductive qualities. Not only does she have her own children, her little broods of spider babies, but she is also contextualized in her being a daughter to an even more prolific mother, Ungoliant, the giant spider monster depicted in the Silmarillion. Shelob and Ungoliant are both depicted as these primal forms of evil. There is nothing left in them except for the basest instincts of hunger and reproduction. Tolkien describes Shelob. She served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow, for all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring that she slew, spread from glen to glen, from Ephilduath to the eastern hills, to Dol Guldur and the vastness of Mirkwood. but none could rival her, Shelob the Great, the last child of Ungoliant, to trouble the unhappy world. The language that Tolkien uses to describe Shelob is very specifically chosen. She is contextualized as the child to a mother, a matrilineal line in which no male intervention is needed. Her broods spread her evil across all of Middle-earth, sinking and festering into the cracks left behind where goodness fades away. And the terms used to describe her physically, bloated and swaying and fat and swelling, are some of the most explicitly corpulent and bodily terms that Tolkien uses in all of his writing. Women in Tolkien's works on the whole are described with very particular terms: fair, graceful, beautiful, these ethereal terms that don't linger in the physicality of these women. It is only Shelob who is depicted in such real and tangible terms, her swaying and sagging figure a cruel perversion of the feminine form. Shelob is only a mother in the most clinical of terms, and it is through her perversion of motherhood that we can start to get closer to what Tolkien thought of as good motherhood. In contrast to Shelob's undying hunger, a mother ought to be selfless and generous, giving more than she takes. Rather than acting as a brood mare, thoughtlessly spilling out your offspring across the world, a mother ought to be involved in her child's affairs. She ought to raise them, to shape them, and to help guide them throughout their lives. And although this idea wouldn't exactly be accepted by the modern perspective, I do think that Tolkien thought of perfection as a kind of deified, holy, pure remoteness. I think he thought of that as one of the traits that a mother must have. The visceral, ugly, and real qualities of an aberrant mother like Shelob imply that the inverse, this kind of remote, idealistic perfection, is Tolkien's ideal of good motherhood. By Tolkien's parameters, then, I think that Galadriel would classify as a pretty good mother. She is fairly selfless, she provided a guiding hand for her child, and she is as distant and serene as they come. But the problem with acting like she is great maternal representation in the story is that there's no child around for her to focus these energies on. She provides a guiding hand to the Fellowship, but I wouldn't say it's a particularly maternal one. There are other female characters, like Éowyn and Arwen, who become mothers later on in the story, but that's long after the events of the story have played out, and it takes place mostly in the appendices. And in the actual text of The Lord of the Rings, these are not described as particularly maternal characters. Arwen is depicted as more a piece of art than a realized human. She is the embodiment of all things holy and queenly, but not motherly. Éowyn, meanwhile, if we're to put her in the lens of the maiden, mother, and crone triad, she is much more the maiden, and she is too far absorbed in her maidenly affairs to be any kind of a motherly character. Just listen to the tone with which Tolkien describes her. Grave and thoughtful was her glance, as she looked on the king with cool pity in her eyes. Very fair was her face, and her long hair was like a river of gold. Slender and tall she was in her white robe girt with silver, but strong she seemed, and stern as steel, a daughter of kings. Thus Aragorn, for the first time, in the full light of day, beheld Éowyn, Lady of Rohan, and thought her fair, fair and cold, like a morning of pale spring that has not yet come to womanhood. She is described as a daughter of kings, not a mother to a future generation. She is cold, cool, stern, not yet come to womanhood. Although she's not an aberrant anti-mother figure such as Shelob, Éowyn quite obviously is meant to fill a different role in the story than being a motherly character, at least during the events of The Lord of the Rings. Rosie Cotton, the future wife of Samwise Gamgee, is certainly not a maiden, not by the end of the story at least, but she's also just not a very relevant character. And I know I'm going to catch some flack for that because Rosie is one of the examples often paraded around of good female representation in Tolkien's works, and while I do like her character a lot, she really just is not present enough in the bulk of the story for me to think of her as really good representation. To the best of my estimation, her name appears about 16 times in The Lord of the Rings, which, for context, is the same number of times that the name of Eoreth appears. You know, the random old healing woman in Gondor. So, while I love Rosie Cotton, I do think it's a bit of an exaggeration to call her representative of good motherhood in Middle-earth. She's just not in the story enough for that. Besides, once she has Sam's children, Sam's role as a father is spoken about much more than her role as a mother. We see all of this through the lens of Sam's character. And this is fair, Sam is a much more main character in the story, but it means that although she is a mother, Rosie doesn't really get to have any impact on the story as a mother. I will say that Tom Bombadil's wife Goldberry does demonstrate some classically maternal traits. She's very warm and welcoming and domestic. She cares for them in the way that a mother might. However, she and Tom did not have any children, so I don't think that she really counts as an example of a mother character. There are a number of deceased mothers in this story that come up. One of my favorites is Gilraen, who is Aragorn's mother, who sacrificed an awful lot to get her son to the place that he needed to be in, but her story is relegated to the appendices and doesn't have a serious impact outside of propelling Aragorn onto his path. The loss of Faramir and Boromir's mother has an intense impact on their relationships with each other and their relationship with their father. And the death of Frodo's mother is what puts him in the care of Bilbo, and thus what makes him cross paths with the ring. And I do appreciate that these mothers play such a significant role in the way that they affected the people around them. But I do find it kind of a shame that we don't get to see any of them living to actually impact the story themselves. And this wouldn't stand out so much if it weren't for how many examples there are in The Lord of the Rings of strong fatherly characters. The relationship of Denethor, Faramir, and Boromir is one of the most poignant stories in the book. Foster fathers like Theoden and Elrond have an intense effect on their charges. There are so many different examples and different kinds of fatherly guidance and strength in this story, but there's just not really much for the mothers. Now, this is not the case for the Silmarillion, where there are just overall far more characters, but specifically far more female characters. But I will say that the proportion of dead mothers to living mothers is roughly the same as it is in The Lord of the Rings. It is bad news if you are a mother in Middle-earth that wants to live a full and happy life. Almost all of the Silmarillion's greatest heroes have mothers that are no longer with them. Beren, of Beren and Luthien fame, was raised by his father after the destruction of his family's house. Tuor, the hero of the Fall of Gondolin, lost both of his parents and was adopted by a man, and Feanor's mother was long gone by the time he started getting up to trouble. And for Tuor and Beren, this makes a certain sort of sense. They are both human and thus mortal, as were their mothers. But in the case of Feanor, his mother Miriel should have been immortal. She was an elf, and that makes her loss all the more agonizing. As the story describes, in the bearing of her son, Miriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for the release from the labor of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Feanor." Miriel didn't just die, she burned herself out, pouring her entire spirit into her son, so that he might live even as she dies. And in this degree of radical self-sacrifice, Miriel has thrown off the balance of motherhood completely. Yes, she fulfilled the first of the parameters, selflessness, but the second parameter is that she remain around to guide and to help her son. And without her guiding presence in his life, Feanor goes off the deep end. He remembers her as perfect and pure and deified, but without his mother actually around to guide him, Feanor commits some of Middle-earth's worst atrocities. Feanor hangs on to the memory of his mother and her spirit to his detriment, and in the end, the spirit that his mother gave him flares out of control, and he too is consumed. But even mothers who survive the gauntlet of birth are not safe from the judgments of good motherhood versus bad motherhood, because there are a number of mothers in the Silmarillion who are just absent. The main ones that come to mind are also actually in the story of Feanor, namely Aredhel, the wife of Feanor, and Indis, his stepmother, his father's second wife. Both of these women gave birth to powerful sons in powerful families, but after the birth, they simply fade into the background. The fathers of these children are enormously influential. Finwë is an elf king. The vow that Feanor imposes upon his son shapes the events of the rest of the Silmarillion, but the mothers have almost no impact on their children's lives. They have leaned fully into the third aspect of motherhood, this remote distance from their child's life. But without having done self-sacrificing, without having put their children on the rightful path, they fade into irrelevancy. Without self-sacrifice, tragedy, or death to lend these women's lives profundity, they cease to matter whatsoever. But not all of Tolkien's mothers fail so completely, and I think that Idril is an example of really great motherhood. Idril was a princess who married Tuor during the events of the fall of Gondolin, and it was her wisdom and her ferocity that allowed so many lives to be saved during this tragic event. Idril implores her husband to dig a secret escape route, knowing that trouble is coming, and when that trouble does arise, she takes arms to save her people and their beloved son Aredhel. She goes out onto the streets as the city is sacked, saving survivors and guiding them to her escape tunnel. When she and her son are taken and nearly thrown off the battlements in a revenge ploy, she fights, as Tolkien describes, like a tigress, tooth and claw, to preserve the life of herself and her son. Idril plays an essential role in guiding her family and her people to safety, even if she must make the sacrifice of watching her father die to ensure that the rest of them can make it out alive. She is wise, she is fearsome, she is self-sacrificial, she is hugely influential in the life of her son Aredhel, but this cannot last forever. Her story concludes, "In those days, Tuor felt old age creep upon him, and ever a longing for the deeps of the sea grew stronger in his heart. Therefore he built a great ship, and he named it Erame, which is Sea Wing, and with Idril Celebrindal he set sail into the sunset and the west, and came no more into any tale or song." In the world that Tolkien depicts, no good things can last forever, and this goes especially for the care of a mother, and this does have a wounding effect on her child. Although Aredhel goes on to be a storied and successful hero, there's always a part of him that is searching for his mother and father, wherever they have sailed across the seas. I hesitate to call Idril's choice to leave Middle-earth selfish, because she did so much good in her life, but perhaps in the narrow parameters that Tolkien has laid out for positive motherhood, this is a kind of failing, or at the very least, a wound. This failure is made the central focus of the story of Morwen. Morwen is the mother of the accursed boy Turin, left behind to defend their home after Hurin is imprisoned by Morgoth. There are Easterlings attacking them constantly, and although Morwen is repelling them by her powers of sorcery and fear, she sends Turin away to safety. She sends him off to the distant kingdom of Doriath to be raised by the elf king Thingol. This is very technically a wise choice. It is a choice that ensures Turin's physical safety, but it disregards his emotional security. Time and time again, Turin begs his mother to join him in the safety of Thingol's palace, but fear holds her back. She gives birth to another child, a daughter, but once again, fear rather than wisdom guides her ways. She refuses to leave their home until the last possible moment, and by the time she leaves to chase after Turin, it is too late. He's already gone to face his destiny, and although it would be wrong to say that this is Morwen's fault in any serious way, Turin was cursed by basically the devil himself. Undoubtedly, her fear-based actions put Turin on the path towards tragedy. Morwen spends the rest of this story trying to make up for this sin, but fate has made its mind up. Both of her children spiral deeper and deeper into despair. They end up taking their own lives, and Morwen is left to die, ignorant of their final fate. But I think that one of the most poignantly tragic stories of motherhood in Middle-earth comes from the character of Aredhel. Aredhel was the sister of Turgon, the Lord of Gondolin, and she lived a charmed, safe, and comfortable life in the city. But this comfort eventually began to chafe. She wearied of the guarded city of Gondolin, desiring ever the longer, the more, to ride again in the wide lands, and to walk in the forests as had been her wont in Valinor. And when 200 years had passed since Gondolin was full wrought, she spoke to Turgon and asked leave to depart. Turgon was loath to grant this, and long denied her, but at last he yielded, saying, "Go then, if you will, though it is against my wisdom, and I forebode that ill will come of it, both to you and to me." Despite her brother's misgivings, Aredhel departs Gondolin, and at first she revels in the freedom that she finds. She finds friends to stay with, she lives whatever life she wants to live, but still this is not enough. She rides out alone day after day, further and further beyond the bounds of safety, until she is found by the dark elf Eol, who lusts after her, imprisons her, and forces her to marry him. Eol and Aredhel have a son together, and once he's old enough, Aredhel begins to plot with this son to escape Eol's imprisonment. They make a break for Gondor, but Eol is hot on their heels. Eol decides that he would prefer his son be dead than be without him, and so he throws a spear at his son. But Aredhel jumps in front of the point in time. It wounds her, it poisons her, and she dies. Her son is deeply traumatized by her sacrifice, and goes on to do wicked deeds. He is the Judas that orchestrates Gondolin's fall. I don't think that it's fair to say that Aredhel's sin was selfishness, nor would I say that she didn't provide any guidance to her son, except that she was taken away from him prematurely. Rather, I think that Aredhel's failing was that she was just too real. She was a flighty person, someone who made rash decisions and didn't want to live with the consequences. She was a caged bird who didn't recognize the safety that the cage around her provided. Her choice to leave Gondolin was not wrong, perhaps misguided, but misguided in a way that a lot of us are. This isn't a simple black and white, right or wrong sort of situation. She's just somebody that made a mistake, that got in over her head. She was self-sacrificial. She guided her son as best she could, but because of these very human failings, perhaps her son was not able to put her on the kind of pedestal that he would have needed to in order for him to achieve greatness, or at least to avoid the call of evil. Aredhel and her missteps are often thought of as the inciting incident of Gondolin's terrible fall, and it is a truly frightening thing that all of this grief could stem from the simple sin of being human. Fortunately, not all of Middle-earth's mothers are human, and that means that some of them are able to get a little bit closer to perfection. And I think that the best example of this is Melian. Melian is a Maiar spirit, just one power step below the almighty Valar spirits, and she came down to Middle-earth and fell in love with the elf king Thingol. Together they ruled the kingdom of Doriath, and they gave birth to their beloved daughter, Luthien. Melian is, by all measures, a good mother. Luthien is a well-adjusted child, Melian uses her divine powers to cradle their lands in safety, and her divine foresight allows her and Thingol to keep their people safe for centuries. When Luthien brings home her new human boyfriend Beren, Thingol is quick to react like a classic dad would, an overprotective dad, trying to get Beren to go away, but it is Melian who pulls him back from that ledge and urges him to take his daughter's feelings into account. Melian helps Luthien discover what has become of Beren when he leaves on his dangerous quest, and although she sits by and watches as Thingol imprisons Luthien in a tower to keep her from chasing after Beren, she generally acts as a positive guiding force in the story. In other people's tales, Melian demonstrates how these motherly qualities aren't just reserved for her own child. She sends Lembas bread off to Turin to help him in his troubles, and she heals Hurin of his grief-induced madness. Eventually, Melian does depart Middle-earth, but I would say that by all accounts, she fulfills Tolkien's criteria of a positive motherly figure. She gives more than she takes, she is warm and engaged in her child's affairs, and by nature of being essentially an angel, she holds up very well to the process of deification. One might extrapolate from this that the only way to be a perfect Tolkienian mother is to be in some way fundamentally angelic, to be inhuman. So that means that we have one all-around solid mom amongst a huge sample size of mothers that are either absent, failed, or dead. And when a pattern like this is this prevalent in a story, and when that story has gone on to influence so much of today's fiction, it's worth examining why that pattern may have been created in the first place. In his writing, Tolkien drew heavy inspiration from historical literature, and within historical literature, dead or absent mothers were certainly quite common, and this was for a couple of reasons. First off, maternal mortality used to be a much more likely outcome of childbirth. In the 17th and into the 18th century, maternal mortality rates were around 1.7%. These days, that number is just around 0.03, and that's considerably lower. So that means that when many of today's classics were being penned, it was just much more likely that the person writing or reading the story would not have a mother figure, and thus would put this into the story or would want to see it represented in a story. Sexism is also definitely a part of the absence of mothers in fiction, because for a very long time, women on the whole did not have a particularly large role in the world of storytelling, especially the kind of storytelling that Tolkien was fond of. A mother might be mentioned for the context of one's birth, but once hearth and home were left behind, in these quests, battles, and adventures, women, and especially mothers, had no place. Sure, there might be a lovely maiden waiting for the knight at home, but the stories tend to fade to happily ever after, long before that woman undergoes the process of going from being maiden to mother, and thus being rendered undesirable by the eyes of the story. And beyond just societal norms, it was a very useful trope for a character to not have a mother. Mothers, traditionally speaking, were meant to be kind of nagging. They would want the hero to stay home, to keep themselves from harm's way. A father would have the wherewithal to know that a son must go off and do this dangerous thing in order to make his name, but a mother will only hold the hero back. A living and active mother complicates things unnecessarily. She's just going to get in the way of true, pure heroism. But a dead mother could be a potent tool, because a dead mother could be perfect. And for a very long time, especially from the 18th century Enlightenment and onwards, perfection was expected from mothers, living or dead. A mother should be wise, serene, she shouldn't have problems of her own, and she should be absolutely, completely stable, so that her peace could counterweight the chaotic lives of her sons and husbands. As Juliette Berger explains in her essay on dead mothers in fiction, a mother's power was through her influence on the men around her, who in turn would take her influence with them into the public sphere. But this stability of character, someone who never grapples with her own trials and tribulations and is in every regard flawless, is simply impossible. A mother is human, just like anyone else, and she cannot be this unchanging force who acts only for the sake of others. Only in death can she be eternal and thus romanticized. She becomes a symbol without her own wants and needs that might conflict with the people she is supposed to support. Therefore, by killing off a mother, an author provides a moral compass to guide the characters, yet one who cannot interfere and thus complicate the narrative. For a very long time, the standards for mothers was excruciating perfection, and it was seen as a disappointment when the real human could not live up to those standards. But through the romanticization of fiction, we had a chance for the perfect mother. All we had to do was take this real human character and mummify them, purify them down to their simplest essence, remove all of those complicated, rough edges, and you end up with this character that isn't human anymore, but acts as a very good propellant for the complex human and typically male protagonist. And while I do think that Tolkien was in a lot of ways deriving from this trope and this kind of problematic deification process for his writing, it is a bit more complicated than that. Because in many of the cases of Tolkien's characters, the death of the character's mother does not drive them forward into success, but rather predicates their fall. Feanor is not so much inspired by his mother's loss as devastated. Aredhel's son falls down a terribly dark path after witnessing her traumatic sacrifice, and Morwen's intentional choice to remove herself from her son's life doesn't result in her being deified, but it does result in her son being lost forever. There's enough complication added to these situations to make me think that Tolkien wasn't just blindly trotting out these tropes, however much they may have shaped his perception and the way that he wrote. And yet, I can't deny that Tolkien's motherly characters are frustrating to me, as a woman and as someone who knows a lot of mothers and cares about them deeply, because these characters never have the same kind of agency or presence that their male counterparts do. However, I do think that we can find a probable cause for this isolation and alienation of mother characters in Tolkien's personal life. Tolkien's father died when he was very young, and so his primary parent growing up was his mother, Mabel. Mabel Tolkien was his very first confidant, his very first teacher. She was the one that gave him books to read, that taught him to read, and that began to teach him languages. They were as well off as could be expected, but this would all change when Mabel converted to Catholicism, something that her Unitarian family strongly disagreed with. They cut her off financially and emotionally and personally, but in all of this turmoil, as their family was cut adrift, Tolkien only came to admire his mother more and more. Mabel's workload increased, her health declined, but she always did her best to stay true to her faith and to do what she could for her children, and in the eyes of 11 or 12-year-old Tolkien, she began to take on a near-saintly glow. Mabel Tolkien died on the 14th of November, 1904, and Tolkien firmly believed that she had done so as a martyr, that she had died for her faith. Tolkien and his brother were taken in by a family friend, a priest named Father Francis, and Tolkien took shelter in the church. He came to see his Catholic faith as the final and most profound gift that his mother had ever given him, and he clung to his faith with all of a lonely child's longing. But a faith awakening would not be the only result of Mabel's death. As Tolkien's biographer Humphrey Carpenter describes, his mother's death made him into two people. He was by nature a cheerful, almost irrepressible person with a great zeal for life. He loved good talk and physical activity. He had a deep sense of humor and a great capacity for making friends. But from now onwards, there was to be a second side, more private but predominant in his diaries and letters. This side of him was capable of bouts of profound despair. More precisely, and more closely related to his mother's death, when he was in this mood, he had a deep sense of impending loss. Nothing was safe. Nothing would last. no battle would be won forever. Her death made him a pessimist, or rather, it made him capable of violent shifts of emotion. Once he had lost her, there was no security, and his natural optimism was balanced by deep uncertainty. In the wake of his mother's death, Tolkien portrayed all the hallmark signs of a traumatized child. Modern psychology recognizes that children who have been traumatized, especially by the loss of a loved one, tend to exhibit traits such as depression, a change of behavior or attitude, and a loss of hope or confidence in the future. And even though Humphrey Carpenter was writing before these criteria had been laid out, it seems like he outlines these exact traits in Tolkien. This sudden tilt into pessimism, this unbreakable lack of confidence in what will become of him and the world that he loved. Children who have been traumatized by loss also tend to find themselves falling into paranormal or supernatural thinking. They see signs and omens everywhere. They see another layer to the world. And through Tolkien, this may have manifested in both his sudden leaning towards Catholic faith, but also in the very spiritual lens through which he saw the entire world. For Tolkien, there was meaning to everything, to words, to trees. Well into his adult life, he was known to speak to trees. But either way, with all of these symptoms looked at together, I think it's fair to say that Tolkien was profoundly traumatized by his mother's loss, in some ways that probably he didn't even understand. And undoubtedly, these feelings continued to impact him forever. When speaking about his relationship with his wife, who was also a young orphan, Tolkien recalls the dreadful sufferings of our childhoods, from which we rescued one another, but could not wholly heal the wounds that later often proved disabling. Now, I am well aware of the fact that The Lord of the Rings is not allegorical. We should not look at The Lord of the Rings as if it is an autobiography of Tolkien's personal life. But his experiences had a profound and undeniable impact on every part of this story. Yes, he is describing and depicting these experiences that are ancient and universal and shared by us all, but these experiences were, in their conception, first bounced off of the mirror of Tolkien's mind. And I think this fact becomes vividly clear when it comes to his rather strange portrayal of mothers. Tolkien's mother shaped what he saw as good maternity. She was selfless right up until the very end, always putting her sons before herself. She was a massively influential and guiding force in Tolkien's life, putting his feet on the path that would take him to so much success and joy and fulfillment. And she was gone, and thus rendered untouchably perfect, any and all flaws buffed away by the abrasion of nostalgia. It kind of leaves me wondering if Tolkien was just at a loss on how to describe a good living mother. His mother was perfect, and she was dead. Therefore, if any mother was to be perfect, death was an inevitability. There is something heartbreakingly beautiful in the fact that motherhood was the one topic that Tolkien seemed unwilling to fully broach. There are so many deeply personal and deeply traumatizing things that Tolkien explores in his works with so much depth and passion and curiosity. He fully explores the loss of home and self that comes about with the passage of time and the overtaking of industry. He doesn't shy away from the challenges and sorrows that can be found with young love. Even the atrocities of war are faced head-on, not shying away from the things that Tolkien found truly troubling. And yet motherhood, in all of its reality and depth and fear and complexity, is left out. Now, I want to be crystal clear here that I am not pointing out the shallowness of Tolkien's mother characters as a kind of condemnation or cancellation. I think it is evidently clear that Tolkien just had a lot of stuff going on when it came to his experience and his perspectives on mothers. He was human and thus beautifully imperfect. And in the same way that it would be unfair to demand absolute flawlessness from a mother, so it is wrong for us to look back at Tolkien and expect him to be anything other than complicated and messy and human. We shouldn't be putting him up on this pedestal and deifying him and trying to crystallize his works as the perfect paragon of fiction writing, because that does a disservice to the real person that he was. Instead, we can read his works, we can appreciate them for all of the good things that they contain, and we can examine the ways in which his personal experiences may have colored his writings in ways that aren't necessarily constructive in the modern day, and we can try and do better. They say that you should write what you know, and I think that Tolkien did that. He writes about mothers with a near godly reverence, almost a fear, and an unstoppable instinct to keep them at arm's length. But I think that for all of us going forward, we also have the responsibility to write and to tell stories based on what we know. And I think that most of us would say that we have a very different experience of what motherhood is and what it can be than Tolkien did. On her deathbed, Aragorn's saintly mother says, "I gave hope to the Dunedain. I have kept no hope for myself." Although this is a poignant sentiment, and one that undoubtedly would have meant a lot to Tolkien himself, I hope that most of us can see the fact that in order to give other people hope, you don't need to leave yourself scoured out and empty. You don't need to blow out your own candle in order to light someone else's. The sacrifice of a mother is a beautiful thing, but my hope is that the life of a mother, the real, messy, complicated human life of a mother, has even more potential. In the comments, let me know who your favorite Middle-earth mother is. I admittedly have a huge soft spot for Idril, just because she's one of the most active and badass, and although she does eventually leave, she waits until her son is fully grown, which I feel like is kind of the best option out of all of the ones that I've been presented today. You see, I was gonna tell you to send this video to your mom, but I do talk about dead mothers a lot in this one, so maybe that's not the best bet. But you should go and find a mom somewhere, preferably one that you know, and tell them that you're glad they're alive and that you love them, because they could probably use that. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every other week to hear me talk about The Lord of the Rings, the art of storytelling, and the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.